Multilevel governance is the topic of today's lecture. Multilevel governance describes the dispersion of authority away from the central state downwards and upwards. And you hear here the two-sidedness of multilevel governance. Downwards is to subnational governments below the central state. Upwards is into the international arena. So we're talking about international institutions there. So what is multilevel governance? What is the logic behind it? And where do we find it?
Well, we're going to begin with the functional logic, the logic of optimality. And here there is a lovely and simple principle. And we describe this as the golden rule of multilevel governance, which is straightforwardly centralize when necessary, decentralize where possible. So this summarizes the trade-off at the heart of optimality, at the heart of multilevel governance, conceived functionally. That is what is best for a society, irrespective of the politics or the community of that society.
So let's unpack this a bit. Centralize where necessary. A larger jurisdiction can have several benefits, and there's two chief dynamics at play there. One is the notion that as you're producing a non-rival public good, one where my consumption of the public good doesn't diminish your consumption of the public good. Generally speaking, the more people contribute to that public good, the cheaper it is to produce it. So imagine the idea of having an insurance against natural disasters. Living in North Carolina, where hurricanes are not unusual in the fall, it's a good thing to know, it's comforting to know that if something really, really bad happens, there is an overarching insurance system, a national insurance system. For small countries, banding together in a larger, coherent international organization can be a means to gain power that they could otherwise not even dream of, right? So economies of scale is one big dynamic. The other one is that if you have a public good or a bad that spills over into another jurisdiction that actually generates damage among another group, it can make sense to create a jurisdiction that encompasses everyone who is affected by some public good or some public bad. Think of pollution, industrial pollution or river pollution. You might just, instead of having just the people who generate the pollution, also the people who are affected by the pollution involved in decision making. Or think of a finite resource like fresh water in a river delta. You know, these are typical situations where scaling up the government, generating a government that encompasses a number of groups or people or states or regions can make sense.
Absolutely. And so those are powerful arguments for scale. But in the absence of those, or where these are very weak, the default option should be to decentralize. Why? Well, in a way, I'm sure you will recognize that the closer a government, for that matter an organization, but a government is to the individuals that it serves, the more information it will have about what those individuals are living through, what they want, and the greater the effect, the ability of each individual to shape the output. So there are under three headings, three basic reasons why decentralization, small is beautiful, in the words of E.F. Shoemaker. Smaller governments work better unless there are overriding reasons to centralize, to have scale. And the first is responsiveness. That is to say, it's much easier to respond to a group of, say, 20 or 200 than it is to 200,000 or 1 million. And that's the argument that democracy works better in smaller groups. Each individual has more effect on the outcome, the smaller the group to which that individual is a part. So responsiveness is the first kind of principle. The second is diversity, heterogeneity. And that is to say, where individuals are experiencing heterogeneous conditions, diverse conditions, where they have diverse preferences. So it makes sense to have the government at that level. So take, for example, the difference between an urban area and a rural area in terms of the demand, say, for transport. There'll be a lot of differences in policy conditions. Let's say a particular region is suffering some, let's say, a disaster.
Right.
Now, you'd want overarching insurance, as Liesbet mentioned, but you'd want to tailor the particular response to the particular circumstances, the particular conditions of that region. Or say in one region there were particular preferences. You don't want a uniform policy. If you can tailor the particular government policies to the preferences of individuals living in a particular region, so much the better. So, let's say, for example, in Canberra, they want buildings at a particular height. They have particular preferences over planning regulations. Why should, if it doesn't have externalities, if it doesn't affect the people in, say, Raleigh or Charlotte, why should the decision then be made in Raleigh or in Washington, D.C.? It's better to decentralise, where you don't have externalities, as Liesbet was mentioning, that would lead to scale. And the third principle is innovation. That is where you have differentiation of governance, so you have the possibility of trying out different things in different parts of the country. And so, for example, you could check out different healthcare systems in different states. And in one, say in Massachusetts, you would check out universal healthcare. And if it works there, then
you could upgrade.
Then you could upgrade and you could try it out.
Other units could.
You could upgrade in other units. So you have greater diversity of experience by virtue of decentralization.
So I think you get the gist of this. Centralize where necessary, decentralize where you can, desirably. So let's play with this. And here what you have is 5 theoretical levels of government, and we put numbers there in terms of roughly population numbers that might go from A, which is a local level, to E, which is the planet, the global, the 7 billion plus people here. And on the right you see a number of policies that might be desirable for public policy, where governments might want to have a policy. Now take a minute and take a pencil and just make quick, short notes of these policies and put next to it what you think, just applying the criteria that we just set out, what you think is the most optimal scale of government for each of these policies.
So write out the topics that we have, the problems, and what is the scale of government that is most appropriate to each of this, A to E. And we'll give you a few minutes to do that.
All right, here is our solution. I think there's some easy ones. Let's start at the extreme ends. I'm guessing very few would have put nuclear proliferation at the A level.
Yes, indeed. So nuclear non-proliferation looks like it's a global issue as regulating carbon emissions.
Yeah.
And there the externalities, you're talking about a public good that really encompasses the entire planet.
Yes.
Precisely in terms of non-rivalness and non-excludability. Both of those are planetary for carbon emissions and also, we would say, for nuclear non-proliferation. What about the other extreme?
The other extreme, garbage collection, preschool hours. Where the externalities are very limited in terms of garbage collection. some of you might say, well, in terms of garbage processing, that's a different issue. But we're talking here about collecting on a weekly or bi-weekly basis the garbage that households tend to produce. You obviously want to have this organized at a local level, close to the community.
So, for example, let's say in an old age where people are at age, they can't drag out their containers.
Yeah.
Well, you might have a different system for garbage collection. It could be a little bit more service-oriented than if it's in a more diverse or younger neighborhood. Preschool hours would depend on the kind of occupations that people have and the preferences of those people living in that particular neighborhood or region.
Of families with young children. If you're in a retirement community, obviously that's not a priority. But
so there's one point that is worth emphasizing here, and that is, look, we're looking at specific policies, but often policies are jumbled together in ways that reach across scale. Mm-hmm. So, for example, garbage collection, you mentioned processing of garbage. Well, that might be at a much larger scale. And often policies are composed of a kind of a mosaic of different scales. And so you'd want to think about the way in which the levels of decision making would connect with each other.
Yeah.
And that actually is when when Liesbet and I gave a talk on this. There's a group at the OECD, about 50 researchers working actually on multi-level governance. And what they are particularly interested in is the way in which these policies fit together in different ways, and the problems and potentials that are given by that. And
how overall policy making actually requires a lot of coordination amongst levels of government, right? I mean, and so one might say job training in hospitals are at the regional level, but not the local level. Industrial pollution in universities at a slightly greater scale. It's a bit flexible because universities can be at a much larger scale as well. The university that we are connected with in Europe, the European University Institute, actually is a combination of 21 countries that contribute. So that's actually at the D level, at the level of D.
At the level of D, yeah. But you would generally think that an energy grid and a judicial system should be at the continental level. That would be the most appropriate scale to supply those kinds of policies. Well, so what's the outcome? Now let's think about this in kind of systemic terms. The one thing that you see very clearly out of this is that national states are both too small and too large. And so what we propose is thinking about a ladder of governance. This is really multi-level governance. This is a picture of government at a limited number of levels, encompassing exponentially increasing population. And the population scale that you see on this slide is a log scale. That is to say, as you move from left to right, it's ever greater increments of population that you're going to be seeing along this scale. And so what we have here is A to F, 6 levels, from the very local F to the global level, and everything in between. And you'd kind of collect policies, whereas each policy may have a unique scale of provision. It would make sense to collect those, to have economies of scope in government. So you wouldn't have 100 levels, but you might well have many, and what we actually perceive in the world around us is 5 or 6 or 7 or 7 levels. And so where the state is, where your national state is, in terms of this array of possible levels of government, is arbitrary. So a very large country could be, China could be right almost at the top, not global, but at the continental level. A Luxembourg would be at A or at B, or maybe a middle-sized country at C. And so the logic of this is that smaller countries have more international governments. In other words, they have to deal with policies for which their own state is too small. And larger countries, well, they'll still need a global level of governance, but they'll have many more subnational levels of governance within them to meet the functional requisites of optimality in the scale of public policy provision.
So let's look at the actuality of the ladder of governance in a couple of countries. And what you see now on your screen is three examples of a citizen in Tianhe in China, at the top right there, a citizen in the United States, the bottom left, and then a citizen in Luxembourg. And imagine you are a citizen in one of these three very different settings, and you look up, I suppose, and you count the number of governments that has some sway over your life. And you see, strikingly enough, pretty similar number of governments, but they will be called differently. They will actually be more or less at the same kind of population level, but called differently depending on your setting. So look at China now, and you see China is very high up on this ladder of governance, and as a result it has multiple layers, 4 to 5 below it. And then look at the greatest contrast, Luxembourg, a country with just over 500,000 people, which has Luxembourg as the nation state as the third highest, the third level up, but then three more meaningful levels above that: Benelux, European Union, and then the globe with its panoply of international organizations. And then on the left you have the United States, and imagine sitting here in Chapel Hill, and Chapel Hill, Orange County, North Carolina, United States, and then 2 layers above that. So you see at work what Gary was talking about. If you happen to be a citizen of a small country, that country will have a greater need to participate in layers of government above the nation state. If you happen to be a citizen of a large country, there will be more layers of government below the state. But even then, even the largest country like China is, cannot do without a layer above it to handle public goods that have a global scope.
Yes, indeed. And so what you're describing is really like a Russian doll system.
Yeah.
Where you have one level of government kind of within the other. And what is kind of so notable there is that these levels do not intersect each other. So it's as if when you're looking up and you're seeing these concentric kind of circles of jurisdictions getting ever larger going to the global level. But each one is contained within the other. And what that is if you were a mathematician trying to kind of figure out how could I have scale diversity in the provision of governance, but at the same time have the minimal levels of government and making things simple that one's contained within the other. This is the kind of system that you would design.
So it's like an exponential scale, isn't it? It's
yes.
not, yeah. And so let's look at a wonderful example. Here is France, and where you see this at work. And maybe we'll start at the top end. You have the globe, 7.3 billion people. Then within that you have a series of international and regional organizations, of which the European Union is the one that's most relevant to France. And you see France itself there as one of, then this is a map of 2018, then 28 members of the European Union.
Yeah.
Right? It's the dark green territory there. And then we can go inside France. And the first layer there is 13 regions, metropolitan France. One of those is Corsica, the island here off the coast. And then we can go back into each of these regions.
It's like delving in. It's like just going deeper and deeper in if you just kind of focus your camera with ever greater specificity to the département, 97 départements in metropolitan France. And then within the département, you go one step deeper, 320 arrondissements, and then the canton, and then the commune.
Of which there are many, because the smallest commune, I think it has, I think 7 people, according to the latest census.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah.
So, some of them, these are old established rural villages, and some of them have become depopulated. They haven't changed. There's this kind of it has a historical kind of authenticity. But what you'll see so interestingly is the départements have this congruence in terms of their shape.
Yeah.
And whenever you see something as kind of as congruent as that in the world of multi-level governance, in the world of jurisdictional design, you know that there's been human design. It's designed. It's
not natural, you could say. And in this case, this is actually a product of the French Revolution.
Indeed.
And the French Revolution was truly revolutionary in the sense it really wanted to break away the past. And there was a deliberate attempt to wipe out the vestiges of the medieval past, of feudalism, particularism, provincialism. And the Constituent Assembly meeting in 1789 set out to really start French anew and to create a French people.
Yes.
And one of the instruments they thought was most powerful was to simply get rid of the old provinces and bishoprics and replace them.
Yeah, and this was so they didn't, when they were naming these, they didn't want to use the old terms. It was arranged such that any individual in a département could visit the capital and return. The mayor could do the same in reverse. So this was the kind of the rationality of the revolution.
So the territory was cut in equal squares, as equal as it could be.
Yes, on the basis of a chessboard. It looked like a chessboard in the original designs. You can imagine what Burke said about this. I mean, for him, it was everything, how not to organize a society. It was a carte blanche, imposition of rationality. And he wrote some very powerful attacks on precisely this territorial organization. So France is unusual in this respect. Napoleon tried to do this in other places. We'll see that a little later, or discuss that briefly a little later. But every country that we've looked at, and we've looked at quite a few, has this nested jurisdictional design at a limited number of levels across vastly different scales.
Yeah.
That is the common feature in a wide variety of different contexts.
So, and we've talked about the functional logic that leads you to expect it, and it seems as if governments are listening to it and just apply it. But there is another logic, a distinctly different logic.
Yes, this is the logic of community, as you might expect. That is to say, life, politics, governance, multi-level governance is not determined by its functional optimality. And there are groups of individuals who have some common feeling for their community and who resist being ruled by foreigners, who want to exercise self-rule. And this creates a demand for regional decentralization within states. It also creates a great amount of conflict in the world today, because much of the conflicts, the political conflict, and often the most deadly, has to do with the demand for self-rule. In most cases, the demand for statehood.
Yeah.
But it also reaches into the demand for a homeland, or the demand for some greater self-rule within an extant state. And this is independent from efficiency. You can demand some greater independence to set the rules, to set the laws of your region, irrespective of whether it leads to more or less economic growth.
Remember how we thought of community and group loyalty and group identity as something that is not primarily driven by rationality, by calculation, but that is really taps into our emotional self. And we talked about how the human brain itself reflects this. It's the limbic brain more than the rational brain that governs how we develop loyalty and identities to groups. So that is at play here, and partly explained why you can get these enormous pressure for recognizing communities, even if there are serious economic and other costs involved.
Absolutely. And what we now want to turn to are some of the sources of this community, of this demand for self-rule in the context of distinctive community. And the first factor is geographical. That is where you find individuals living in an island who are separated from the mainland, or it may be an island, or it may be some territory that is distinct, non-contiguous with the other regions of a country. And you may well find, it's often the case, that people living in such a context have greater interaction with each other than with the other individuals living in the country. And so they have more in common with each other than with those living in the remainder of the state. And it's not unusual to find that such groups, such individuals within a group have a demand for greater self-rule within a state if they don't demand total separation from the state itself.
Think of Greenland, the Faroe, Hawaii, Cyprus, Puerto Rico, which is both the most distant significant island away from the United States and also distinctive in terms of its culture.
Yes, indeed.
Many islands are distinctive in some fashion, also either they're states or they have a certain autonomy acquired within the state of which they're part. Right?
Yes, if you look at the population threshold for states, on the continents that population threshold is around 10 times as high as the average population in island states. So islands tend to become states, and within states they tend to have greater self-rule.
So that's one source. The other source is language regions, by which I mean a region, a territory where a majority of the people speaks a language that's different from the dominant language in the country, the language in the core of the country. These regions have a tendency to also be in demand for self-rule. And language is something very peculiar, in modern life at least. Language is a powerful marker, something unavoidable to just go about living your life. It's what you need in order to get educated, it's what you need to in order to participate in arts and media, it's your communication mode with authorities. A court system needs to work in one or another language, even your work life, right? So it's something that is inescapable and that therefore can be perceived by a group that speaks a different language from the rest of the country as something they want to cherish, that they want to protect, that they want to promote. And so there you can see the link to its demanding greater authority, greater self-rule.
Yes. So it's a double-edged thing, two-sided thing.
Yeah.
One, language promotes the sense of community. It can often embody the sense of community. And two, it's often the topic of the subject of dissension. Yeah. That is, what language shall we speak in this particular territory? Prior statehood is another element that contributes also to the desire for self-rule. And first of all, on the basis that prior statehood can often produce institutions, distinctive norms and customs that have a very long half-life, that kind of have a self-sustaining character once they're in place. We noted already last time the institutions of Scotland.
Yeah.
And these were, Scotland itself was part dynastically merged in Britain from 1606, but the institutions survived. And while they didn't kind of create demands for Scottish home rule in the 19th century, when Scotland benefited so much from Britain's empire, and often Scots were instrumental in running the empire, later those institutions fomented or underpinned the demand for more self-rule for Scotland.
Yeah. Another example would be India, right, where many of the now states of India had a history of prior statehood before British colonialism, and then when the British colonial powers retreated, these kind of old memories, and it's more than memories, it's real institutions, just became salient again, became important, and it led groups of people to demand that India would be federal.
Yes, and then on kind of layered over that are national myths.
Yeah.
And sometimes they have a basis in reality, sometimes not. The way in which Scottish national myths have been kind of harboured and promoted, also in films, is one of those instances. And one finds this often, that the creators of the demand for increased self-rule promote national myths about the past, even very deep in the past. I mean, for Scotland, we're talking about pre-1606, when Scotland was an independent state. For Wales, we're talking about pre-15th century, the 1400s, but really the 1300s was where Welsh independence had real meaning. And so when we assessed statehood, independent statehood, in the project that we're going to be talking about and mentioning in a little while, we had to take a period of 800 years to capture the effects of independent statehood for contemporary jurisdictional design.
It just harks back to Alan Ostrom's wonderful definition of a community. It's a group of people who have a shared past and a shared future. And that shared past can go far back in time. And as you point out, it can also be imagined and reimagined, sometimes in very creative and not always terribly truthful ways, in order to sustain the sense of community or to mobilize the sense of community for contemporary politics.
Yes, so that's why nations are often referred to as imagined communities.
Yes, Benedict Anderson's wonderful phrase.
Yes, indeed.
Now there's a fourth factor, and that is the character of the regimes. And in a nutshell, the democracies have a tendency to accommodate this communal diversity. Autocracies tend to repress it. In a democracy, the right to protest, the right to vote is sacrosanct. It's meant to be sacrosanct, free and fair elections. And so that provides channels, legal channels, routinized channels for communities that feel uncomfortable, say in the skin of the national state, to protest, to demand self-rule, and so forth. And there are routinized ways of dealing with this, by allowing it in party competition, by perhaps allowing a regionalist parties to sit in government for certain things. There's ways to accommodate distinctive communities to a large extent. Autocracies may sometimes do that, but it's rare, because there's always the threat for an autocrat that any source of opposition might just become an opposition against his rule. And particularly territorially entrenched oppositions seem threatening in the eyes of many autocrats.
It's so true. I mean, the direst threat often comes from territorially entrenched oppositions. I mean, you can have an ideological opposition, fine, but when you think about civil wars, these are often between groups that are entrenched in communities that are territorially rooted. And you can see that the strategy for an autocrat, if that person wishes to die a natural death, is to eliminate the roots, the sources of potential opposition, as Liesbet is saying. And so there's this kind of inducement for an autocrat not to kind of lose a battle against some territorial minority that wants to establish greater self-rule.
So as Gary mentioned, we just went out and about and started to measure regional authority, the extent to which a central state devolves or disperses authority to regional, subnational levels. And we call this the Regional Authority Index. This is a project. When did we start it?
I know, a long time ago. At least 10 years is not probably quite the right number.
And we've had wonderful people working with us who just live in various parts of the world, which you need because you need local expertise. And we continue to work with them. I think
yes. In several parts of the globe.
Now.
Yes, indeed.
Anyhow, to get to it, what we now cover is we cover 95 countries, which includes all of Europe, the whole of Latin America, and major parts of Asia, including the small countries of China and India. And what we attempt to do is almost like a temperature, gauge the temperature of regional authority from year to year, from 1950 to 2018.
And we do this not at the country level, but we take the individual region as a unit of analysis, and of which there are about 15,000. So you can imagine it's a big project. We've had to gain major kind of funding for this to see this through on a number of different dimensions. And so what we'd like to do is take a peek at 2 countries and then look at some of the forces that we've been talking about in the context of those 2 countries.
So here is a map of contemporary China, which has 33 provinces at the highest level. You see them here, and you see them wonderfully colored. And the colors represent some of these different paths towards community that we talked about. So the green color stands for a region, a province. In the Chinese case, that's an island. Red is a province where that is a language region, that is where the majority of the people do not speak Mandarin Chinese, which is the dominant language or the core language in China. And then blue stands for regions that were the heart of a contesting state, that were a state that in a way didn't make it, that failed, and that has been absorbed in China as a whole. And as you see, there are several regions there that have a multitude of these characteristics. It's also important to realize that these tend to go together to some extent. If you have been a prior state, there's a good chance that you also have a distinctive language. And as Gary was mentioning, an island has a greater chance of having more interaction within than with the outside world, and that may, for example, as you see here with the island of Hainan, that may help sustain a distinctive language. A couple of things I just want to highlight here. You have, first, you see the top layer. China is a big country, as you know, 1.38 billion people. Underneath that layer are 3 to 4 more layers. So the functional logic is very strongly at work in the Chinese case, in the sense that you get multi-layered governance. But the other thing I want to note is that the provinces, it's interesting, China is not a federation. It's the largest country that is not a federation. And that, I would guess, has to do with the character of the regime. It's not a democracy. And as we said, authoritarian regimes are more reluctant to devolve authority to the subnational units. But the provinces do some things. They have a score of 7.5 out of a scale of from 1 to 30. So they're not nothing. There's a range of things, in fact, they do. But they would have less, for example, financial powers. They don't have direct elections, so there are no provincial elections the way we know them. They're the indirect elections and a number of other things, right? But I want to point out one more thing, and that is the distinctiveness of these regions. All provinces have the same authority, but there are 7 that have a distinctive status in the constitution. And they happen to be the ones that are also the most distinct in cultural terms and in historical terms. So you see in the northwest, Hooghe, the big one, with the blue-red stripes, the horizontal stripes. The vertical stripes is Tibet, of course, you probably guessed that. Inner Mongolia, the long salamander-like area in the north of China. There's only 2 regions with stars, Macau and Hong Kong, that have distinctively more authority than the rest. And these are, of course, the most recent that joined China.
They're also the most contested, and it's well to know that Hong Kong, with its inherited kind of independence, because it was a part of the British Empire, can well be viewed as a source of opposition to the regime on the mainland, and that goes quite a long way in understanding the current contestation and the imposition of Chinese direct rule in Hong Kong.
Indeed, indeed. So China shows the power of authoritarianism and how that constrains the dispersion of authority to subnational governments. But even there is significant authority at subnational levels. Spain tells us a similar story, but more dynamically over time.
So when you look at the slide on Spain, what you see are 6 special status regions in Spain, which have a lot more authority, self-rule, than do regions in China. We're talking about some of the most authoritative regions actually in our data set. So we're talking about a 30-point scale from a 0, no self-rule, to a 30, extensive, the maximum self-rule, and this is in the region of 24 for the Spanish regions that are starred. And what do they consist with? Well, it reflects some of the principles that we have been discussing. Ceuta and Melilla are divorced geographically from the rest of Spain, the only parts of the EU in Africa. They speak distinct languages. The majority of the populations, speak Berber dialects of Arabic. The populations of Galicia, the Basque Country, Navarre and Catalonia either speak languages that are distinctive from Castilian Spanish or have a history of independent statehood or both. And Spain is not a federal state, but it's so close to a federal state, people call it a federal state. It's about as close to a federal state as you can get without being federal. And that takes us to the 19th century and the development of liberalism, the demand for centralization, the demand to create a coherent identity, Spanish identity, in a coherent state.
It's when nationalism became a mass movement, right? I mean, before life was kind of, or the relationships between the parts were mostly relationships among dynasties or noble families. It rarely touched the lives of ordinary people, which is most of them peasants or perhaps traders, towners, not really. There was very little. The contact among the regions was very much dominated, monopolized by a very small proportion of the population. That began to change in the 19th century.
It did. Actually, Napoleon had something to do with that.
Yes.
Because the Spanish resistance to Napoleon was in part a popular resistance. And so there was the sense that you could actually be Spanish because the differences across these regions for many people in that context were not as great as the unity of resistance to Napoleon, which eventually was successful. Well, then we come up to the 20th century and the fact that democracy in Spain, the Republic, was defended in the last reach in the regions of Spain, in the Basque Country, in Catalonia chiefly, and Franco's revenge against this resistance led him to not only to mass murder, the killing of tens of thousands of people who defended the Republic against him, but also to the suppression of these local or regional cultures and languages.
And particularly Catalonia got it in the neck.
Particularly Catalonia.
Catalonia was really perceived to be the core of the opposition against Franco.
Yes, indeed.
So when Franco then won, he immediately rescinded all rights, whatever institutions, rights including the right to be taught in Catalan in schools was rescinded.
Yes, and that resistance is beautifully rendered in one of George Orwell's great books, Homage to Catalonia, an autobiographical novel in which he really analyses the way in which the communists, who are the authoritarian communists, the fascists and the anarchists, chiefly based in Catalonia, interacted and eventually lost that civil war against Franco.
And of course, if you want to be reminded of the brutality of the war, there is the beautiful painting by Pablo Picasso, Guernica.
Yes, indeed. And so the slide that you see in front of you is the result of democratization in the mid and late 1970s, in which there was suddenly the opportunity to express these regional cultures, this demand for self-rule that had previously been suppressed, and suddenly rose up, and there was a cascade of regional bargains, beginning with the historic regions of Catalonia, with the CIU, the Catalan Independence Party, the Basque Country, and Galicia.
And then Andalusia jumped in. Andalusia, as you can see on the map, has some distinctiveness because it was the last vestiges of the Umayyad regime, the Muslim regime that had been governing Spain until the 14th century, 1415.
So there was this kind of competitive mobilization. One of the interesting things about Spain is it illustrates something that I've experienced in my life in Britain, and that is when one part of the country discovers its identity, so to speak, Scotland. Yeah. So when I was growing up, I thought of British and English, and I was kind of confused, as most people were. But when the Scots mobilised, suddenly people in England realised that after all they discovered, sometimes to their surprise, that they were English.
You were born as a Brit and you grew up as an Englishman?
Kind of, yes. Yes. I still feel very British, I have to say, as well as... but this, and then people started wearing the flag of St. George. Well, it was the same in Spain. When the Basques and the Catalans said, well, this is who we fundamentally are. And then the Galicians and Andalusians and others became more aware of their identity. And there was this competitive kind of identity mobilization that took place across Spain. And the result being a regional state based on autonomous communities, which is the situation today.
So under Franco, these regions didn't exist, or had been abolished. So literally, in technical terms, in our regional authority index, they have 0 because they're not there. And then you can see the rapid rise in authority from, in numbers. I think it starts at 10, and it's now, as you mentioned, 24, actually 25 for the Basque Country, right? So this thinking through the functional logic and the community logic alongside each other goes a long way in understanding the structure of government in our society.
And then we add democracy into the mix,
you have to.
Which kind of facilitates, kind of a intervening variable. It kind of mediates the effect of functional pressures and a community for the current jurisdictional design of a country.
Indeed.